How we doing, everybody? It's Wardy here, and as you can see, we're back at it breaking down all the latest in Mets land. And today, that being November 6, 2025, not only is it the official start of MLB free agency, but the New York Mets have wasted absolutely no time making some roster moves getting set for 2026, as we're going to break down the latest acquisitions of Hwan Bae, as well as the return of Jose Castillo, who the Mets lost in waivers throughout the course of the season to the Seattle Mariners, but are now bringing him back there, this time from the Baltimore Orioles. We're going to break down each of these individual players, their games, and their expected roles for the 2026 season. From there, we're going to get into what is happening with Edwin Diaz and the latest regarding a new contract. We're going to break down where the Mets currently stand based on latest reporting, and ultimately what is likely to happen this offseason between the New York Mets and Edwin. From there, we're also going to break down what is happening with Antoan Richardson. As we did yesterday, our immediate reaction is seeing both Antoan and Jeremy Hefner leave the Mets organization to join the Atlanta Braves in a lateral move. For Hefner, we knew this wasn't a shock given the fact that the Mets parted ways with him, but for Antoan, there's been a contract dispute and there's been a lot of uncertainty as to what led to this point. Yesterday, I was kicking and screaming and crying how David Stearns maybe did not pony up the dough. Today, I'm here to correct myself and break down these further details on why Antoan Richardson is no longer the coveted Mets first base coach. That and so much more in Mets land, including the official announcement of their new third base coach that we broke down a couple days ago, but we'll reaffirm right here, right now, is what we're going to get into. So all I ask is that you hit that like and subscribe on your way in, as it's a fantastic way to support the platform, and let me know your initial reactions, thoughts, and analysis to the following topics here in Mets Lane down below, everybody. Thank you guys so much for doing exactly that, and shout out, as always, to our amazing sponsor that makes every single show here happen, everybody, that being our great friends there at SeatGeek, that has you covered for all of your ticketing needs. As you guys see there, I love SeatGeek and their app because it's so easy to navigate. Go inside the app and look at that grading scale system. It is 1 to 10, red to green, meaning if you purchase a ticket in the green range, more in the 7 through 10 range, it's a fantastic bang for your buck. Otherwise, you'll have one more in the red range, 1 through 4. That is not a good bang for your buck. They're transparent. They tell you what are the best offers versus the least best. So whatever you need in the ticketing space, everybody, whether it's NFL season tickets, whether it's NHL, NBA, concert shows, comedy shows, you name it, SeatGeek with over 70,000 active events to choose from, making them the #1 rated ticketing app in the game today for a reason, has you covered. Use my link down below, our promo code WARDY10, that is WARDY10, because you're going to get 10% off your next ticket purchase there, everybody, and I'm going to be using them big time because I'll be attending the arguably the biggest card of the year for UFC fight fans, that being the next card a weekend from now at Madison Square Garden, all thanks to my great friends with SeatGeek, in which I purchased my tickets through there. So make sure to check them out, everybody. And now let's hop right into this one, and let's begin here with the news that you guys see beside me. Let's start on a positive front today, because there are positives to get into today's video, maybe some negatives as well, and I'll break down each and every one of those things as why exactly that is. Now, starting here, as you guys can see, both Pete Alonso and Juan Soto have officially been anointed as Silver Slugger winners for this year. Congratulations to both of them. For Juan, this isn't surprising. He has now been a Silver Slugger for 6 consecutive years, but the bigger takeaway is Pete Alonso, who for the first time in his career is in fact landing that Silver Slugger award there out of the first base position out of the National League. Alonso, who's actively a free agent, as we know, who obviously will be having quite the back and forth this offseason as the Scott Boras client with David Stearns and Steve Cohen and everyone else in company. What we do know is that Alonso was unbelievably valuable to the Mets this past year. The home run came for the Mets in more ways than one. 30 home runs, almost 130 RBIs. Was there not to love with Alonso? And between himself and Juan Soto, as you guys see there from my staff there, check it out at the WardyNYM. Give me a follow on X should you guys have interest for our main account. And for my personal account, where I have more of my hot takes, reactions, whether you love them or hate them, head over to WardyNYM on X. Basically the same thing, but a little bit different. We see a combined 81 home runs and 231 RBIs between the two. And this is a duo that we would love to see more than a one and done. You know, Juan Soto was a one and done in the Bronx as a duo with Aaron Judge, but we don't want to see it be a one and done of him as a duo with the Polar Bear and Pete Alonso. And the only exception that is, if it is going to be a one and done, the Mets must make sure that they supplement the proper offense for this team next season in a scenario where Alonso walks, either based on their decisions, that being Stearns and Cohen, or more so Alonso's stubbornness and decision because maybe he wants a certain contract that the Mets just are not going to go ahead and do for more reasons than one. Not saying it's going to happen. I'm just saying anything is obviously a possibility this offseason when evaluating the very uncertain future of one Pete Alonso. But definitely let me know your initial reactions to that in the comments down below, everybody. I personally don't care too much about awards nowadays because if there's one thing that I learned a couple of years ago, when Juan Soto became a Gold Glove finalist for the San Diego Padres, when he was quite literally one of, not the worst defensive corner outfielder in all baseball that year, I have since completely disregarded these awards for the most part. I'm sorry, but stats are important, and to completely deviate away from them just because you focus on the big name is a major problem. So whether it's Silver Sluggers or Gold Glove, Platinum Glove, you name it, even All-Star Game, as we know, because it's fan-driven to vote these guys in, I simply care a whole lot less versus what I initially cared about growing up as a fan. I'm curious if you guys feel the same or if you're different in the comments down below. But to continue our conversations, because obviously a lot is happening at Metsland, let's also talk briefly on the latest hire for the New York Mets. As you guys can see, they're officially announced by Joel Sherman of the New York Post. The Mets plan to hire Tim Leiper as their third base coach. He had been the previous third base coach for the Padres each of the past 2 seasons, and Tim Britton was the first to report on the early interest in Leiper. And who was the first to talk about this on YouTube, everybody? It was yours truly. We talked, 48 to 72 hours ago in a previous video, and you guys can check it out because I have on the thumbnail, it says new third base coach on it because it was always going to be Tim Leiper. You know, we saw reporting going back to when Will Salmon first came out with a report for The Athletic. He is the main man on the beat for the Mets, along with Tim Britton for The Athletic, and he did state that the Mets were closing in on announcing Justin Willard as their new pitching coach, which will be official in the coming days. We're just waiting for that to officially be announced by other reporters as well as the Mets themselves. But in that same process of happening, Andy Martino actually quote tweeted that from that we saw in Will Salmon and stated how the Mets are closing in on a third base coach hire as well. Separately on Blue Sky, I don't know how to pronounce it, and that's okay. I don't use it. The alternative to X that many of you guys are on, Tim Britton had posted how keep an eye on Tim Leiper and the New York Mets because the Mets had interviewed him for an unspecified position, but the belief is that it would be third base coach in a lateral move. As we know, the Mets have parted ways with Mike Sarbaugh, who was their third base coach this past season. Really did not look great down the stretch, really missed the mark in more ways than one have felt. He's been around the game for a while, and I wish him the best with his future endeavors, but it will not be as a New York Mets coach. Leiper, and I do like this hire because not only did he work side by side with Manny Machado on the hot corner the past couple years, something that could certainly bode well for the Brett Beattys and to a lesser degree the Mark Vientoses, the Ronnie Mauricios, etc. And I say lesser degree not only because of their lack of defensive value, but also because we have no clue what is going to be next season roster-wise for this team. It's very hard to believe the Mets are going to run it back with all of Beatty, Vientos, Acuna, and Mauricio. I'll have to believe it when I see it. Otherwise, I'm expecting inevitable trades to be had there. But to have that kind of great work with Machado is not only going to bode well with hopefully the continued upside of Beatty should he not be dealt in his own right this offseason, work more on his defensive game, which really prospered big time this past year at second and third base for the most part. But also, how is this man going to be when actually bringing in guys from third to home? You know, that's all we really care about when it comes to third base coaches, right? We had the Gary D. Sarcinas of the world that were as conservative as ever. Literally, you could have had all the time in the world to get to home. You could have read 2 Harry Potter books, and he's still going to keep you at third base. Then you have the ultra-aggressive Joey Cora during the Buck Showalter regime, who's now the third base coach, as we know, for the Detroit Tigers. He's been doing a good job over there. Very aggressive, and a lot of times he was just sending guys home, even when it simply did not make sense. Then you added Mike Sarbaugh from the Cleveland Guardians over the past couple of years, and Sarbaugh was solid, but not a needle mover by any stretch. I'm curious how Leiper will be, because he's not only a man who's been with the Padres the past couple of years as their third base coach, but he also formerly worked with, yes, John Gibbons, previous Mets bench coach up until this past month as he left the organization, as we know. Gibbons, who obviously is actually, for those that are unaware, a former Mets player that didn't blossom because he went down with injury as a catcher. And you want to know who filled in the shoes for him as catcher? It was, in fact, the kid and Gary Carter. Kind of crazy how that all worked out. But Gibbons went on to be manager, as we know, for the Toronto Blue Jays. That's where he had most of his success as a coach. And when he was manager of the Toronto Blue Jays, who did he have work under him? It was, yes, Tim Leiper. So Leiper has some of those internal ties with the Mets going back to Gibbons. Also, actually played in the Mets minor leagues as a player growing up there, going back in the 90s. So there's been levels of connections between himself and the Mets that led to this point in the lateral move. And knowing that the Padres have a new manager heading into 2026, which is a really fascinating hire, and Craig Stammen, for those that don't know, was a reliever just a couple years ago, Major League Baseball for a while. Hasn't pitched since 2022. And now he's the manager at the young age of 41 or so there for the Padres. So I'm curious to see how AJ Preller and the Padres go about that in 2026. But they were going to have a changing of the guard with their coaching staff after Mike Schilt retired inevitably, which meant Leiper was going to be seeking a new job elsewhere. So even though it was lateral, it makes sense why it was lateral because of everything that I just relayed to each and every one of you. So you guys let me know your thoughts about the latest third base coach hire for the Mets. We expanded more on him a couple days ago in content, but in summary, this is pretty much what you guys need to know for the most part. So now going on from the coaching hires for the New York Mets, let's get on to a little bit more here as to what is happening in the free agent market, the players the Mets have acquired, the big Edwin Diaz news that we have today, and to wrap up the show, we'll talk a bit more on the Antoan Richardson situation because it was a bit different versus what our initial reactions were yesterday when we were first finding out the news that the Mets are not bringing Antoan Richardson back and he's going to the Braves because of a salary indifference. Of course, I was going to crash out over that. What do you mean a salary indifference? But there's key context to that to share. But before we get there, let's see from Jeff Passan today, because as we know, everybody, the 13 players were tendered qualifying offers Thursday, sources tell ESPN. And as you guys can see, it is Kyle Tucker, Kyle Schwarber, Bo Bichette, Framber Valdez, Dylan Cease, Rainer Suarez, Edwin Diaz, and that's the news that we're going to get into with Edwin in a second, as well as Zach Allen, Shote Managa, Michael Caine, Trent Grisham, Gleyber Torres, and Brandon Woodruff. So, immediate reaction to this. Not at all surprised for the most part. Edwin Diaz was always getting the qualifying offer at just over $22 million. He will inevitably say no to that. He will decline, but this significantly helps the Mets, and here's why. And similarity to how Pete Alonso had his market completely shrink an offseason ago, as the Mets threw the QO on him, do not be surprised if the market is not as favorable as what was initially expected for Edwin Diaz because of this exact thing. Knowing that you have to give up a compensation pick to acquire a player in the free agent market when maybe that player in your eyes is not a needle mover for you is what makes so many teams hesitant to do it. Now, Diaz is most certainly a needle mover as an elite closer. One of the best, if not the best in baseball right now. So there's definitely an exception to be had where teams may actually show a further willingness versus some other players out there with QOs because Diaz is an absolute dog, understandably so. But the point here is that not only do the Mets have a great opportunity to bring Edwin Diaz back for the next couple of years at minimum, but they put themselves in a position that at absolute worst, if Diaz does say somehow, some way, walk and go elsewhere, they will be getting a draft pick for him. And the belief here is that the Mets will be able to handle things with Diaz, get a new contract done, because that compensation pick is enough to deter some teams away from making his market as inflated as what it was initially going to be heading into the offseason. Of course, a team like the LA Dodgers, who are in desperate need for a closer after botching that Tanner Scott contract throughout its first year already, they're looking to add a big weapon like Edwin. But for Edwin, how much of a priority is it going to be to, say, sign with a team like LA versus returning the Mets, who he has openly said himself he would love to return the Mets in the scenario where he, say, opts out of his contract. So we know how much the Mets have valued him. We know how much Steve Cohen loves this man. So it really just needs to come back together again. It might be a little bit of a lengthier negotiation versus a couple years prior, but the point here is that even if it's lengthier, this is normal. This is how the offseason typically goes. And the Mets lucked out. We're very fortunate after the 2022 season to sign Diaz right away. But that doesn't typically happen for top free agents hitting the market. You know, they really were able to cater to him then, and that worked greatly. But now it's going to be more of a normal paced offseason with Edwin Diaz. So don't be surprised if you see the inevitable rumblings and different rumors that we talk about. Oh my God, this team may be closing in on Edwin Diaz, and then bam, he still returns to the Mets in the end, or something along those lines. You know how the offseason goes, everybody. In case you don't, just buckle up and get yourself ready for the ride. A lot of reporting, a lot of rumors, sometimes nonsense, and try to go through the weeds to figure out what's faction, what's not. Obviously, is easier said than done at times, but we're going to be covering it all here on the platform as we always do. But to expand more, not just on Edwin Diaz, but about this list, look at these players. How many of these players do you realistically think David Stearns and Steve Cohen are going to go scorched earth after, knowing that they have the QO on? If I'm being as unbiased as possible, and as someone who's evaluated everything that Stearns has done the past couple of years, and understanding that Stearns may be far more aggressive this offseason than years prior, knowing he finally is pressured down his neck by Cohen after what was a very frustrating 2025 season where everything imaginable went wrong and fell, it's still hard to envision there being more than a select few players here that check off the box enough for the Mets to say, hey, yeah, we'll give up a draft pick for him. Absolutely. And of these players, currently, Kyle Tucker, Kyle Schwarber, to a degree Bo Bichette, and possibly one of Framber Valdez, Dylan Cease, and Brandon Woodruff fall in the category of players who we could see the Mets still potentially heavily pursuing, even with them having the qualifying offer. But for the most part, there's a great reality that the Mets do not land a single player on this list outside of an Edwin Diaz reunion for the sole purpose that they do not want to give up a draft pick for someone that maybe is not enough of a needle mover for them, and they could acquire a separate free agent without a qualifying offer attached, or someone in the trade market, because there is a lot of question marks surrounding this Mets rotation heading into next season. They have a lot of guys under contract, but a lot of them that are far from proven, and a lot of them are far from great. So how do you fix that? It's by, of course, adding to said rotation. And when you look at the free agent options available right now, do the New York Mets really have an appetite to give up a draft pick for a Dylan Cease? Do they have an appetite to give up a draft pick for a Efraim Valdez? Do they have an appetite to give up a draft pick for Ranger Suarez? They most certainly are not going to do it for Shota Imanaga, more than likely. So Michael Kane, similar conversation here. How far are the Mets, Zach Gallen, East Coast native, how far are they willing to go? And I think this will all be indicative on not only how these markets shape up, ultimately, what players find themselves more in the shorter term end, because we know Stearns is not going to give a 7-year deal to any of these starters. Not going to happen, barring changes. I'll be shocked if it happens. I really will be. I'll be scratching my head as to why it happens. Should have happened. But the point here is that when you look at these options, not a lot of them really check off enough boxes to say, hey, let's go ahead and do that. Knowing that there's an abundance of options that'll be available in the trade market to a degree. I say that to a degree. There's an asterisk there because it can be an abundance of options as long as they're actually, in fact, traded or going to be traded. Otherwise, it's all nonsense. It's just for the sake of having the conversation. But when looking at free agent and trade options, the Mets do have a lot of starters that they're going to be able to at least inquire on this offseason. And should some of these markets falter to the shorter term end, that's where I'd anticipate a guy like David Stearns to pounce. Otherwise, very hard to envision him going long-term with any of these starters, barring changes. But when it comes to the position players, this is where it's interesting, because Kyle Tucker, he's currently seeking a contract around $300 million. Now, that's around $200 million less than I initially anticipated heading into his walk here. But given the question marks that he had after what was a little bit of an injury plague towards the end of 2025 season for him as a one and done as a Chicago Cub, because the Cubs aren't going to pony up the dough to bring it back. They're not going to do it. I know they're not going to do it. Do you know they're not going to do it? I'm pretty confident. Point is that Tucker, while he's not the best player on the planet, he's going to be getting a pretty payday because he's one of the most well-rounded outfielders when he's right. He's not only a World Series champion, but he's someone that absolutely has a balance of both offense and defense that you're looking for when he's at his best. And you may say to yourself, oh, $300 million for Kyle Tucker is not worth it, or $400 is not worth it, north of $500 is most certainly not worth it. Okay, but is Juan Soto really worth $765 million? No. It's not about what a guy's actually worth versus what the market deems that they are. And for the Mets, knowing that you have a likely lockout an offseason from now after the 2026 season, these guys are going to be looking for the big bucks and the big deals. And teams may not get the privilege again to sign players to this great significance like they have in years prior. So for the Mets, there is something to be said about flexing the financial guns now while you still can. Because God forbid if there is a world where you see a cap and a floor, it's not just an even playing field, but it changes the game for Steve Cohen, who is far and away the most wealthy owner in baseball currently. If he's not able to flex those guns as an advantage, that may most certainly hurt the Mets in their continued pursuit of players because they don't have the continued success to suggest that alone is why you should land here as a New York Met. So between David Stearns having a level of aggressiveness, Steve Cohen going into this offseason scorched earth and pissed off, understandably so, one does have to wonder how far the Mets going to be willing to go for some of these players, knowing that you're going to have a lockout a year from now more than likely, knowing that a Kyle Tucker, you make work. You make it happen. And you make it happen by shifting Brandon Nimmo to DH or Juan Soto, one of those two, and then having Kyle in the corner outfield. It really is that simple. And it's the ability to actually maximize your DH position and maximize your offensive and defensive output. David Stearns is priding himself on trying to make this team better defensively. Kyle Tucker, while he is not necessarily going to be the best outfielder in baseball year in and year out, he most certainly is going to be the type of balance that you're going to want in your corner outfield should you have interest to go down that route. And Kyle Schwarber, not to get on a tangent about him because we will do that a lot this offseason, who wouldn't want that power as your full-time DH every single day, prying him away from the Philadelphia Phillies? Regardless on the future of Pete Alonso, Schwarber is absolutely a player the Mets should be heavily considering to push forward for this offseason. And Bo Bichette, after having a great playoff run, a tremendous World Series, when healthy, this is a man who could be a nice weapon for many teams looking to acquire a nice infield bat. And the Mets have an appetite to, say, trade away some of their infield talent, including, say, a top prospect, Jet Williams, in a monster blockbuster trade this offseason. Not saying they should. I'm just saying if they go down that route, Bo Bichette, an opening at second base, could present itself. Trade away McNeil. You know Bo is going to provide decent defense at best, but a guy who's going to lead bat first for you in your lineup and can obviously be a stud in doing so. A lot of possibilities for the Mets this offseason, everybody, but all I'm saying is buckle up and get yourself ready for the ride. But to continue on the Edwin Diaz discussion, everybody, there was reporting that came out by Will Simmons of The Athletic over the past day that I implore you guys to check out. And he did state in that article on the latest between the Mets and Edwin Diaz is that the Mets have already shown a level of interest in trying to bring Edwin back, according to multiple sources. So the Mets have already started the kicking tires phase at minimum to try to bring back their star closer. That's a great thing. Hopefully it continues in that direction. Otherwise, we're going to find ourselves shooting our foot saying, oh my God, we just allowed Edwin Sugar Diaz to walk and we don't have a proper replacement for him in this bullpen. And there's one thing that is a certainty when looking at how the Mets can make their bullpen great next year. It's by having a shutdown closer who loves New York, who knows what it takes to win here, and has went through a lot of trials and tribulations. This man had the yips, it felt like, scared of his own shadow in year one as a Met in 2019. He is such a different player since that point, and he has not only embodied what it means to be a New York Met, but he loves being a New York Met. And he's got the mox, he's got the fire. He has everything you want from a star closer. Goes without saying, bring Edwin Diaz back. Now, going on from Edwin, who we hope returns, let's talk about players who have now been added to the organization. And let's begin here briefly with one who is returning to the organization, which I most certainly am happy about. And that is going to be, yes, Jose Castillo. Now, in case you guys do not know Jose Castillo, let me enlighten you. Castillo was initially acquired by the Mets off waivers, if not trade, earlier this season from the Arizona Diamondbacks. Now, when the Mets acquired Castillo, they, of course, had this continued revolving door of just a bunch of no-name relievers on their bullpen trying to get some innings, and they needed lefties after both A.J. Minter and Danny Young went down for the entire season with injury. Now, Castillo, who wasn't doing all that much with the Padres, hadn't done anything of significance at the major league level since 2018. Yet, David Stern said, hold my beer, baby, we got something here. And he wasn't wrong. He was not wrong at all. Give the criticisms to Stearns all you want, but when it comes to guys that actually worked out well, their limited sample sizes, Castillo falls in that category, everybody. Take a look at these numbers. Jose Castillo with the New York Mets, albeit limited sample size because he was here 16 games, 15.1 innings, a 2.35 ERA, a 1.7 whip, a 2.6 FIP, 19 strikeouts, an 11 K per nine to a 3.5 walks per nine. Castillo played with not only the Mets, the Arizona Diamondbacks, and the Seattle Mariners this past season as well. And the Mets lost him to the Mariners on the waiver wire before the end of the season, which I was low-key a little bummed by just because Castillo isn't that bad. For what we've called and asked him for, he's been fine. I attended the Mets and Dodgers series in LA going back to, was it June or July of this year, one of those months. And for game one of that series, the Mets won. It was a nail biter. They won and they split that series out of the 4 games, 2-2 apiece. But Jose Castillo, I witnessed, have himself a scoreless inning unscathed against those Dodgers that helped lead the Mets to that huge win that I believe was in extra innings, if I'm not mistaken, or it was in the 9th inning. One of the two. It was a nice win for the Mets. And Castillo was nice to see him in person. He's a towering 6'6" frame, filled out for sure, has moxie on the mound too, and just another lefty to add the mix, which is not a bad thing. Now, when we look at a guy who's not returning the New York Mets, just to talk about him briefly, everybody, we do have here, actually, let me just show you guys just for a quick second on what the Mets were getting in Jose Castillo. It's actually hilarious, the highlights I'm about to play. And quote Alonso after Castillo struck him out. That's actually so hilarious to me that when he was with the Diamondbacks, he actually had some success against the Mets. And then that was basically it. But to just show you guys a little bit more on Castillo here, let's pull up some of his Mets stuff because he, again, was solid with the Mets. Not the best thing, but far from the worst thing, too. Just a towering lefty who can come in and get you some nice swing and miss. And Castillo is now going to be entered the fold currently as the Mets' third lefty option in their bullpen, which is fantastic because the Mets had to rely on him as their number one option multiple times this past season due to their injuries. Have to hope and pray that isn't the case in 2026 because you not only have A.J. Minter returning from injury as he opted into his $11 million for 2026. We're excited to see what Minter can do more. And then we see Brooks Raley as the Mets have opted into his club option for 2026, and he's making what, around $5 million or so. He's making pennies for how valuable I think Brooks Raley is for this bullpen. Those are two quality, high leverage, high tempo relievers. I say tempo in the sense of their ability to get huge outs in key circumstances. Not so much in the velocity, because both Minter and really fail in that regard. Castillo, not so much. And when Castillo's right, he can be nasty. So again, we'll take it. And his stats again that I relayed are what he did with the Mets. Collectively throughout the whole season, he had a 3.8 or 3.9 ERA. But why care about that when we should solely care about what he actually did in the Mets organization, right? So that's why I amplified the numbers the way that they are down there for you guys to check out. But Jose Castillo, everybody, he is a third lefty option this Mets bullpen as of now, heading into next season, barring changes that maybe he's cut, doesn't make the team out of spring training, whatever the case may be. But now, guys, going on from Jose Castillo, who did get a little cup of coffee with the Baltimore Orioles that we did see as well. So what was he on? 4 teams last year? Diamondbacks, Mets, Mariners, or at least 4 teams. He was all over the place, and he was effective. So Castillo, happy to have him back. But now let's go on from talking about Jose Castillo to now let's get on to the next one here, and that is going to be an interesting one, okay? And I say interesting because it's just kind of crazy. You know, from the time the signing first happened, didn't like it then for a multitude of reasons for the most part. The Jose Iglesias replacement, the start of the end for the 2025 Mets, started in spring training with the first play this man made, and was the last play he ever made in Mets uniform. That's Nick Madrigal. This schmuck literally broke his shoulder with the first play he made in spring training. And I say schmuck just because of the fact that I wish the Mets brought Jose Iglesias back for the vibes, and the vibes only in hindsight. Mets could have used that this year. And instead, they signed Nick Madrigal, who's supposed to be that utility option for them. He goes down, makes one throw, and I think it was against the St. Louis Cardinals in spring training, makes one throw to first base, falls completely flat on his shoulder. It's cooked. He needs season-ending surgery, and now he's elected for agency. So, Nick Madrigal, thank you so much for everything you did for the Mets and absolutely nobody. And now let's get on to the next year. And the next is going to be the following. And this man, who I have some choice words to say about, I got to be honest with you. Hwan Bae has been claimed off waivers from the Pittsburgh Pirates. Bae, who played in the outfield last year for the Pirates organization, doesn't have a lot of success at the major league level, but did have plenty of success at the AAA level this past year. And this is another one of those fringe MLB players that the Mets will be bringing into spring training, get some looks, especially because Bae is uber athletic, so I'm sure the Mets are kind of going to view him in somewhat of a similar light to Nick Madrigal as a guy who could just be a huge utility guy for them. He plays second base, and he can play all aspects of the outfield, has speed, and has the contact ability when he is at his best as a batter. But there's a couple problems that I have with Bae here. And I say problems loosely because there's a great reality that this man never plays a game for the Mets next year, or there is a possibility that he does. And the scenario that he does, and I'm not here to be the moral police, because I understand there's so many of my favorite players growing up that have done things behind closed doors that became public that were terrible things that I do not condone at all. That even includes, to a degree, you know, when we think of New York Mets, not just on the 80s with our guys in Dakota and Darryl Strawberry, who obviously had a lot of trials and tribulations then. A lot of bad things happened during that time. Good, but a lot of bad at the same time. Think of Jose Reyes, of course, comes to mind as well. Initially, you think of Jeurys Familia, but that was refuted, if I'm not mistaken, after the fact. But Hwan Bae was suspended during, I believe, the 2018 or 2019 season for 30-plus games because of a domestic dispute. And this domestic dispute was not a good one either, as he was getting a little too physical with his girlfriend at the time. And I'll leave it there. If you guys want to check out the details in its entirety, you can certainly look them up for yourselves. But for me, I'm like, okay, so this guy hasn't really done much of good at the major league level as is. And I'm not trying to say this wrong, so please hear me out. It makes more sense for Major League Baseball teams to continue to run it back with players who have had domestic disputes when they're really good. I know that's a terrible thing to maybe for you guys to hear and for me to say, but it's a fact. We have seen it, and it will continue to be the case. We know how teams operate. If the player's elite, they're going to do everything in their power to make sure that things work out, even if they have a lot of bad things going on off the field. You know, and I don't want to compare one domestic situation to another because they're all completely different in their own right. But as an example, Aroldis Chapman, stud closer this past year, we know, obviously, the disputes that have been around him. And we understand that while that has certainly, I think, to a degree, tainted a bit of his legacy, people are still going to admire and love him as a player because he's unbelievably elite. And he will stay in the league because he's unbelievably elite, regardless on what he did wrong when it came to his lady and things off the field separate from the game itself. But for Bae, let's call it how it is. I'm going to say it right now. This is just some schmuck the Mets are bringing in just to give a showcase in spring training to see what they have, and that's that. Why are we wasting our time here? That's genuinely how I feel. and I do not react to this kind of stuff often at all, to go the lengths of saying that this was a pointless signing, but it genuinely feels like a pointless signing, okay? It's one thing if you're an uber talented player, have all the success, have a really shaky track record, have domestic disputes, which is not at all something I'm condoning. It's a terrible thing, and I will never condone such a thing, no matter the player, no matter how much I may love them as a player, because I love Jose Reyes as a player, but do I love him necessarily as an individual? I can't say that, because his legacy will forever be tainted from what we know publicly. So, to view Bae here, not to harp on this too much, but this just feels pointless in my opinion. You know, I feel like this is only going to cause more potential negative press than it will anything else. But hey, listen, no one should be defined off of maybe one mistake that they made. I'm not here to condone his actions. Far from it. I'm disgusted by them, as a matter of fact. But I also am not one of those people that wants to be the guy that constantly drill down the throat of, oh, this is a terrible person, this is how it is. When people are allowed to change and people are allowed to learn from their wrongs. I don't know the key context behind what led to the dispute of what happened between his girlfriend at the time. All I know is it wasn't good. He was in the fault, and he was rightfully charged because of it, at least by the like of MLB, among others. I don't know in full detail the other little aspects of it. But that's all I really have to say about that, everybody. You know, it's just one of those things, kind of why, more than anything. I'm just head scratching. Okay, we really did this, but we didn't. I just don't get it. In simple put, I do not understand it. But another guy to throw to the mix to see what he can do come spring training, try to impress. And listen, if Bae balls out and he looks great, I'm obviously going to support him from the player perspective because I support every single player that's on this New York Mets team. Good, bad, or indifferent. Doesn't mean I like them personally. Doesn't mean that I condone their actions. No. And I think it's very important for me to make that distinction before people go out of their way to run and say, oh my God, Wardy's in favor of so-and-so. No. When did I say I was in favor of those actions? But if you're going to be on my team and if you're performing well, then it's almost impossible for me as a fan to ignore that and to not acknowledge that, because if the team can go the lengths to bring this player in, see the success that they have, and the players rally around them, then naturally the fan base is going to do the same to a degree as well. So with that being said, I'm wishing Bae the best when it comes to his ability and what he can do for this Mets team. But at the same time, am I going to lose any sleep if this man does literally nothing for the organization? Not at all. Far from it. So with that being said, everybody, because we talked about Bae, let's get on to wrapping up this show to talk about a topic that I wanted to, again, come full circle on and issue a bit of an apology. And I say an apology not because anything was inherently wrong that I did myself, but rather I do not want to steer any fan in the wrong direction because of a lack of information. And that is to a degree what happened yesterday. And that's why I would like to apologize to each and every one of you for that, as well as I'm going to say publicly, that I apologize to David Stearns, because yesterday I had a reaction and said, Stearns cheaped out. You got to be kidding me. How do we reach a dispute in this contract for Antoan Richardson, who is so unbelievably valuable to the Mets in their base running, especially Juan Soto had 38 stolen bags. Heavily credited Antoan for the reason for that. To allow this man to walk to a rival, the Braves, in a lateral move because of salary complications? How could this be? Well, given the details that have come out since then, the New York Mets not only offered Antoan a contract to begin the offseason, but they offered him one that was very much feasible to what they had previously offered him in the past. And Antoan went the lengths to speak to other teams, circle back to the Mets after he did not find necessarily anything that was an upgrade over what he would be doing with the Mets. He had made known his continued interest in wanting to return. It was never about wanting to leave the organization, but rather trying to maximize his dollar amount as well as his ability coming off of a career year coaching-wise. Because it was a career year coaching-wise for Antoan Richardson. Does anyone at all focus or care about what Antoan has done prior to this past season? No, because there's really nothing to flex up until what he did with Juan Soto and the Mets' great base running overall this past season. So Antoan circles back to the Mets, and here lies the problem. The Mets are only allowed to issue 4 pensions to new coaches and their staff. That's just supposedly the thing that happens. Because Antoan took his time to speak to other clubs and did not immediately accept that new contract by the Mets, which did in fact include a pension initially, he shot himself in the foot. The Mets were not able to bestow that pension upon him because of the other hires that they have done since then. When looking at Kai Correa, when now looking at Tim Leiper, as we know, when looking at what we see there in Troy Snitker, among others, all these things factored in, which is why the Mets were not able to give him the pension he was looking for. Pair that with reports that did in fact state that Antoan was looking to have the availability to leave the organization, even if he accepted a new contract, if a greater opportunity arises for him this offseason. And my response to that is, what are we doing here? You think the Mets are going to bend over backwards to not only give you a new contract, but to give you free range to leave at any point if a new opportunity arises, which could completely screw the Mets if, say, you left fairly last minute, closer to the spring training beginning, and the Mets are without a first base coach. So to that, I say, F out of here, okay? That is, in fact, true from my understanding, and that's wrong. I do not at all fault David Stearns for not loving that idea, nor do I fault the Mets for their lack of effort here, because it wasn't really a lack of effort. And that's what I'm trying to correct myself on from yesterday. So, to put a pin in it, Antoan Richardson wanted to return the Mets. He said publicly that he has great respect for Stearns, the organization, and how those negotiations went. So the Mets did nothing inherently wrong. This was all Antoan trying to flex his guns, trying to get some more money elsewhere, trying to get a larger role elsewhere, maybe a bench coach per se, but no one was giving it. So instead, he goes to the Atlanta Braves, a team that he used to play for, had success with throughout his playing career, and a lateral move paired with Jeremy Hefner, who's also going over as the Mets have parted ways with him as their pitching coach. So that is the key context that we know publicly to this point. Should anything come out that's beyond that, we will certainly discuss it on the platform. Otherwise, I think that this has reached the end of our conversation on Antoan Richardson and the New York Mets until we start crashing out next year when he has great success with the Braves, or maybe saying, oh, great, happy to see Richardson didn't really factor into much of anything, as the Mets base running continues to be great regardless of who they hire at that first base position. So that's all I got to say about that, everybody. But you guys let me know your thoughts down below regarding that, along with everything else in Mets land that we broke down today, everybody. Before we get out of here, I just want to make sure that I don't miss anything in particular for each and every one of you. I don't believe that I am. All right, I think we are good to go. So yeah, free agency has officially begun. Do not be surprised when inevitable moves continue to happen for the Mets in the coming days. But I would say that you should be surprised if anything of significance happens for the Mets, signing and or trade-wise, in the next 2 weeks, because you still have, I believe, the 18th and the 21st are two key dates upcoming for the Mets and all Major League Baseball, because you have the date, which is qualifying offers have to be accepted or rejected. We know Diaz is going to reject his, obviously. And then you have tender and non-tender contracts. So in that 4 to 5 day gap from the 18th to the 21st, there's going to be a lot of movement, a lot of traction happening across multiple organizations. And then naturally, as we get deeper into November, the beginning of December, right on the cusp of winter meetings, things are going to get unbelievably hot. They're going to get spicy, and we're going to have so much to cover here on the platform with all things news and rumors based, as we do every single offseason here on WardyNYM. But before we get out of here, everybody, one final thing that I want to let each and every one of you know, and I meant to do this sooner, so that's shame on me for it. Check out my new video, everybody. Check out WardyMLB. For those that don't know, I have a YouTube channel covering MLB-wide topics beyond just the New York Mets. And we're going to be pumping out a lot of content there this offseason, including multiple videos dropping next week. This was our first video that's dropping this week. We will have 2 at minimum dropping next week for each and every one of you, if not more. And our video was on the top 10 MLB players that will be traded this offseason. There's Tarek Skubal, there's Stephen Kwan, and we got Ketel Marte on there as well. You guys can check out that video, and that is in fact collaborated between my channel and WardyMLB. So what that means is, knowing that it's connected with both, the video will not be on WardyNYM, but to anyone that is a subscriber of mine, you will have been notified of that video dropping, because that's what the collab feature really does on YouTube. So it doesn't actually put it on WardyNYM, it's only on WardyMLB, but everyone that's a subscriber of mine on both those respective accounts is notified when videos drop, and we'll probably be doing more things like this, so that way you guys check it out. We're going to be pumping out a lot of fun MLB content. We'll be having a lot of free agent related discussions next week as well on the platform, separate from our Mets conversations, so make sure that you guys are in on it all. But Mets fans, thank you again so much for watching. I greatly appreciate it. Let me know your continued thoughts, reactions, and analysis to all the following topics that we had in the comments down below. And as always, no matter what, everybody, let's go Mets. Peace out, folks. Have a great one.